Welcome back, everyone. Welcome. My name is Marlo Brooks. I am a student, a senior at English, studying English at Cal State San Bernardino. And I am joined and welcomed by my co-host, Yvette.
Hi.
Where are you, Yvette?
Over here.
There
This is
you are.
Yvette Relles-Powell. I'm a student at CSUSB as well, studying communication and environmental sciences. And I just wanted to say also, it's July, but Black trans lives still matter. Keep an ear out for that, keep an eye out for that.
Great. And we are also joined by our other co-host, Kameron Pyant. Welcome, Cam.
Oh, what's good, Marlo? What's going on, everybody? Hope everybody has been, good, healthy, and safe. I appreciate everybody continuing the conversation. I hope we have, a great conversation today. We get a lot of things done, and we figure out where we're going to keep going from, these different conversations that we're having. But, hey, Black Lives Matter, all that other stuff. Keep fighting.
There we go. So welcome, my hosts. Today we have a very special panel that we will be announcing shortly. Another great week for the topics in today's environment. So please welcome everyone. And before we get started with our show, we always here at CSUSB, we always like to give our land acknowledgement to pay homage to the ground which our campus sits on. And just to show our connections to our tribal relations. So we recognize that California State University of San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the Cal State San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use of occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University of San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and indigenous people. So thank you. Now, again, we have a very special show today. And our first panelist that we're going to bring up in our on Conversations on Race and Policing series, we have an associate professor in communication studies here at CSUSB. We would like you all to welcome Dr. Liliana Gallegos.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to be sharing with you parts, something that I made for today, but part of it comes from a statement, a letter that I wrote to the community and the entire university at large. So here we go. Thank you for the invitation. Members of higher education and impacted communities. I have very recently earned early promotion to the level of associate professor at the Department of Comm Studies. Joyous is a moment when the accomplishment belongs to generations of community. Yet with all the support in place, from talks to grants, fellowships, symposiums, associations, why do some of us, people like me, Black, Brown, Indigenous people, still feel as if we are in a continuous struggle for well-being and safety within the actual university? My entire career within academia, 20 years, has been a ferocious battle where no amount of resources has protected me, nor my students, nor members of our staff from colleagues, hate, policing, punishment, harassment, retaliation, and bullying, with actions and comments and statements directly inflicting racial, gender, sexual, and class identity-based violence and hostility. As a professor, I have been referred to by colleagues as an uppity, uncivilized Mexican who thinks she knows better, who makes people feel uncomfortable, who simply does not know her place. And I have experienced the effects of the actions that follow such thinking in the experiences of my Black and Brown students. In addition to the struggles we face due to the human condition, due to my identity as a conscious Black, Indigenous person of color, because BIPOC can also be of internal colonized mindset, I am in an ongoing Coliseum battle within academia and a frequent survivor of what we call the banality of quotidian evil. Yet, I do not dare claim to have survived the war, as the war has been ongoing for more than 500 years in these lands we call the Americas, a very one-sided battle for people of color, recognition, human respect, and rights. I write this in acknowledgement and thanks to the host nation of these lands, the Yuhaviatam, also known as San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, and in honor of those who came before me and fought parallel struggles against supremacist thinking and doing, so that I could be a part of a 2.6 Latinas with tenure. I come here as first-generation Chicana fronteriza with the acknowledgement of being forcefully denied the experience of growing up openly and fully as an indigenous person, third generation of the Tipai Kumeyaay, and fifth of the Tongva, whose national percentage in tenured positions is below 0. With the acknowledgement of being told I am so articulate, even though I have an accent, and I am expected to dress and speak in the Anglo-European style, understood as professional in order to be taken seriously. I come from a family of people who resisted in the ways in which they could, because resistance is dangerous. Even being your own unapologetic self is an act of resistance to those who wish for all to be assimilated into the current ideology, which is but a continuation of coloniality and empire. We all pay for it with our lives some way or another. Some of us die at the bullet, choked, at the noose. Others die of high blood pressure, continuous high stress situations. We get spiritually and mentally sick. We live in this constant pain, and the perpetrators get to continue doing their work of hate and death, which exists in multiple dimensions as a continuous revamp of supremacist oppression. Because the rules put in place for that to be regulated are lax and full of holes through which such acts can continue to take place without end. Our experience becomes hearsay. When you report such experiences, you're gaslit. Your name is given to the perpetrator, and the perpetrator has friends who believe that you deserve to be punished. Together, they launch an attack against you and your students. They heavily police every single one of your moves. And if you make one mistake in the process of those hidden rules, they immediately go and report you, even though they know you're learning. They know you're first generation. They won't give you the benefit of the doubt, though. They send their own students to spy on your classes and ask them to report on what you teach. I myself have a colleague trying to listen to my conversations from within their office. I had a witness when I pointed out a shadow of their feet approaching the crevice between the door and the floor, showing as they were trying to hear a private conversation. I have had inexplicable damage to the tires of my car, 3 flats, 1 every week consecutively. And then it stops when I publicly announced that I had reported it to the authorities. I have no idea why the flat tires happened, but once you're in a place where you do not feel respected, where you feel constantly policed and metaphorically criminalized, you must imagine what that does to you. You start to question their limits. Memories of my ancestors project before me when you can blatantly see the discriminatory cacique-style approach some faculty and staff have towards students, staff, and colleagues. Yes, even people of color whose lineages have unfortunately been oppressed enough, because tokenism is a form of oppression, have been condemned to become unconscious or even conscious oppressed oppressors. Using such tokens as examples to uphold and protect your supremacist actions is one of the laziest and lowest forms. But now this, even when we are afraid to report these acts, as retaliation has been the weapon of choice for my aggressors, we read your words in emails and hear them echoed in the hallways amongst those of us who can see and hear. Oral history is alive and well. We know who the perpetrators are. Institutionalized racism is not something outside ourselves. It is something that depends on its continuous uplifting by individuals within everyday life situations. You do not have to hang a person to be racist. You don't have to kill a person to be racist. Racism is a spectrum. Cognitive dissonance is very real. And here's where the disconnect lies. I reached this point as a phoenix, as a woman of color in flames. I know, like me, there are other flames in the ivory suffocated by the same tactics, waiting for a moment to rise from the ashes of our predecessors. I find it poetic that the phoenix lives 500 years before rebirth. I'm deeply wounded and affected by my experience, and still with an overwhelming need to communicate this information, because after all, as I know for many of you, teaching is a vocation and a calling. True allies are those who take risks and proactively go above and beyond to support and uplift underrepresented and minoritized people of color like me without putting themselves in the center. They bravely stand up to the bullies. They call them out, especially when it's their own friends and family. True allies get blacklisted. They're disliked by the same oppressors. They get blacklisted, punished through supremacist factions that make sure always that one of the representatives is present in part of service positions and committees. Those are that get to decide where funds and the directorships go. I would not be here for those if it were not for those co-conspirators, siblings in the struggle for human rights at all levels of society. I take as evidence of living under oppression the following fact: I cannot share their names with you to protect them. As diversity in our new hires has increased, I live the reason as to why we cannot keep up with the retention of students and new people of color faculty. The notes are a glossary written in my own skin, in our own skins. The differences in retention are not mere coincidences, as there is definitely a way to fix this. But even if I told you how this works, would you even want to listen? Are you prepared to respect my location and try to understand? If not, are you going to make those efforts? If your stand is set in stone, will you retaliate against me instead because how dare I? Will I just become another exit? To begin the inevitable massive shift that is underway, I want to ask those of you who have been silent and all the allies who answered the recently released statement by the Women of Color organization at our institution, claiming that you stand next to women of color in academia and our Black and African American brothers and sisters, to take a moment to be introspective. Ask yourself, if you're silent, why are you silent? Why are you angry? Are you afraid? Can you articulate the root cause of this fear? What is this then evidence of? What have you proactively done to help ensure the environment of discriminatory dehumanization and retaliation continues? How many times have you punished a student with a lower grade simply because they questioned your unbiased teaching, and they refuse to assimilate over an oversimplistic form of thinking that works against their own identities? How many times have you assumed your students did not care about their education, or were lazy, slow, aggressive, dangerous, instead of thinking that maybe it's a problem with the way you teach, the result of the marginal experiences? How many people of color have you ignored, silent? How many times have you witnessed and pretended and minimized what was going on? How many times did you go out of your way to gaslight or minimize people of color's experiences? How many times have you failed to listen and try to understand a perspective different from the current founded in European Anglo-centric ideology? In order to request that you be conscious of your biases, do you expect people to tiptoe and change their language, rhetoric, and cultural forms of expression so it doesn't hurt your feelings? How many times have you been offended or simply felt uncomfortable when people of color have expressed concerns pertaining to discrimination and supremacist thinking? How many times have you thought you had the right to punish someone because you felt uncomfortable or challenged? How many times have you heard warnings about conscious people of color, instead of questioning dispositions and saying why, you have joined them in the witch hunt and asked, what is wrong with so-and-so? What is the chip on their shoulder? You know, instead of asking yourself, what is going on? Why am I so ignorant? How come I didn't know this? How many times have you accepted an underpaid, not fairly compensated position, center of people of color topics and issues in which you were not an expert, but which you took anyway, instead of supporting the efforts to uplift and hire more conscious and experienced faculty? How many times have you looted without giving credit? How many times you're thinking of using what I spoke about today and run with it instead of reaching out to give me an opportunity instead, or any one of us for that matter? How many times have you hit up people of color expecting them to give you their life's work when you could have easily Googled and done the research yourself? How many times have you assumed you can just teach people of color and ethnic studies topics because it's not a real expertise? How many times have you been afraid of being discovered for what you really stand for and have been silent for fear of angering or being seen as a traitor by your supremacist friends? How many times have you given people who look like you the benefit of the doubt but immediately thought the worst of us of color? If a conscious person of color has been kind enough to let you know you're biased, have you retaliated against them by ganging up with others and speaking ill of them instead of doing the work of re-educating yourself? How are you standing in the way of the very much needed ethnic studies requirement in your campus? Why are you not proactively supporting this proposal to become more than just a basic requirement? How come I do not know much about Black, Indigenous, and Mexican Latino culture when most of the people I pretend to serve come from such cultures? Answering the above questions can help you identify ways in which you have participated as a perpetrator, a faux ally, and there are many more ways I am sure would be provided by people if people were not afraid to speak out and receive backlash. The same perverse logic that Frantz Fanon spoke of behind the above experiences feeds the action that leads to the murders, such as George Floyd's and many others before and after him. This awakening does not come from the murder of George Floyd only. It comes from a series of offenses and injustices that would take longer than this talk to say. This would require greater investment from me in the invisible free labor of educating those that simply will not take a stand and do it themselves. As I said before, search engines are virtually free and some of us are academics after all. Ultimately, I invite the entire higher education community to ask yourselves, why are you even in higher education if you will not uplift, respect, and embrace people of color and the underrepresented communities we're supposed to serve? Why are you here if you're not committed to identity-based social justice in all its forms? How can the institution, Senate, CFA, community organizations, centers, families, and parents in the community at large support that we hold each other accountable before campus missions and vision? Is it possible to dismantle the master's house using the master's tools, as Audre Lorde asks? If we can dream, oh, actually she says, if we can dream, how can you rethink your role and do part to make this even possible? Honestly, I personally do not want any allies whose actions are bordered by metaphors. Resources are vital and much needed, but they can only go very far when conscious people of color have to be defending ourselves and each other, advocating for students in the community, while constantly and simultaneously working on teaching, research, service, while spending extraordinary amounts of time and efforts bringing attention to these issues. We need people who listen, ready to shift and open their minds to the experience of people of color at our institution and beyond. We need co-conspirators who respect us and value the different possible approximations to teaching and learning. We don't need people who just want us to be like them, assimilate to their own inconspicuously hyphenated cultural ways in order for us to be able to aspire to any respect. These experiences and action continue to take place even when we do have systems that help propel our development forward, because these are in fact separate yet related things that must be addressed in separate ways. Sources and programming support is like a raft that keeps us from completely drowning from the effects of the continuous floods of coloniality found with its supremacist racism that keeps inequality, lack of diversity, and inclusion afloat. We still have yet to implement something in terms of draining these floods, in terms of prevention from this danger. And for this to be possible, we need swift and constant accountability. If this means we have to rewrite the rules, so be it. It's about time we review this. We need the shift to take place. Black, brown, and indigenous lives depend on it. To begin to move forward, we must acknowledge the detrimental effects identity-based discrimination causes at our institutions and our communities, our families, and our lives. We must hold each other accountable for actions of attempting to enforce assimilation, servitude to white supremacist ways through bullying, retaliation, and other social terrorist acts. Black Lives Matter. I have shared all that I have said with respect and love for life, as well as profound longing for a genuine shift. And if you're interested, I will attach a link or share a link to the petition, because it's a petition. And if you feel so inclined to sign and support what I just stated here today, please do so. And at the end of that petition, you can find a virtual reality film that I produced as a call to action for those who are poetically and visually oriented. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Wow, that's a lot to unpack. And I just want to remind our attendees that at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button. So for each panelist that do present today, if you have any questions that you would like to for them to answer, or for any of the panelists to answer on, or if you just have any questions in today's community, in your communities, or in today's atmosphere, in today's injustices, just please post them down in your Q&A, and we will have a session where we'll be answering our questions at the end of the show. So thank you again, Dr. Liliana. And right now I'll pass it over to my co-host, Yvette.
Before I introduce the next panelist, I just want to say thank you to our panelists for speaking up so openly, for taking this opportunity on this platform. Take the platform, please, take the platform. Tell everybody, put everyone on blast. Thank you for sharing your story, and I will be looking for that link that you're going to be putting out. I'll be looking forward to that. So our next speaker is going to be Dr. Daniel Gascón. He's an assistant professor of sociology at the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Massachusetts. Thank you so much for coming in from Boston, or zooming in from Boston to speak with us all today.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me. As I mentioned earlier, it's a fantastic honor for me to be here with all of you. I was a student at Cal State San Bernardino from 2002 to 2007, yeah, and I got my bachelor's and master's there in criminal justice. I remember working closely with Famega, Schramm, and Levin in the criminal justice department, and mostly Professors Tibbetts and Parsons, who really helped to set me on the path for doctoral study and academia, and once again, I really thank them for that. Since leaving Cal State, though, I have somewhat broadened my focus in some of the ways that my colleague, Professor Conlisk Gallegos, was mentioning. I think she rightly points out a number of structures that sort of overlap with and sort of enforce a lot of structures that impact policing, not only in sort of the criminal justice realm, but also in these others in academia and social life and cultural and political life as well. So I appreciate her giving us that segue into the conversation. Part of the reason why I'm here is to sort of put you on to a recent book that I published with a colleague and friend of mine, Aaron Roussel, who's out of Portland State University. We spent 5 years and conducted an ethnographic study in one community with both members of the public there and police officers who were involved in a community policing program. The book is like a critical look. It tries to attempt to understand LAPD's implementation of policing reforms since the Rodney King riots. But it focuses also on what was once a predominantly Black neighborhood and has become now, for the most part, Black and brown, with significant Central American immigration since the 1980s. And it's also significant because this is a part of Los Angeles, South LA, which is a historic riot zone. Right, two of the largest riots in US history, 1965 Watts riots, 1992 Rodney King riots. Both of those say a lot more about what happened in the George Floyd protest or protests that we saw recently. And I want to speak to that in a moment a little more. The book also unravels the sort of complex power dynamics that you see not only between the Black and Latino public, but also the police and the communities of color in that part of town. One chapter in that book traces the historic rise of LA's different iterations of implementing community-based policing practices that go back to the 1940s. You know, my co-author and I, in one of the chapters, look back, start looking at community-based policing practices that emerged from the 1943 Zoot Suit riots and how they're similar to and different from what we've seen since then. But again, today I want to focus on a couple things in particular. I want to try and clarify some of the connections between what we see in the George Floyd incident and what we see in some of these others historically. I want to say a little bit more about what I think these quote unquote race riots are all about, what they mean, what we can do about them. And I also want to talk about efforts to reform, you know, what's been done in the past, why they didn't work, and where conversations are going now about the future of policing, particularly in urban and communities of color. So the first thing I wanted to say about the George Floyd riots is that this is the same kind of violence that we've seen in urban areas since the 1960s. It's a very common post-civil rights kind of reflection on Black and white relations in the United States. You see a white police officer sort of surrounding this man, leading to his death and using a very problematic and questionable police tactic, one that departments across the country have come back since and denounced. There's videographic evidence sort of undeniably showing the problematic practices, the same kind of thing that we saw in the Rodney King case. And we also see that the protests themselves are not a reaction to this one instance. I appreciate Professor Conlisk Gallegos' comments once more, because just like she mentioned, you know, it would take a whole talk to really elaborate on all of the different structural factors that feed into why people are in positions of marginalization, particularly Black Latino bodies in the United States. You know, it stretches from segregation in housing and in the economy and employment and schooling and health and sanitation, and the list goes on and on and on. So these kinds of reactions, these protests that we've seen, and even the violence that sort of spilled there afterward, are all a reflection of what we've seen over not only generations, but particularly in the last decades, this sort of increasing marginalization on all of these different levels for people who are living in urban centers. Now, one of the reasons why I really challenge when people talk about quote unquote race riots, I know that it's like a shorthand for understanding that this is a moment or an eruption of violence that really has to do with broken race relations in the United States. But I think it really diminishes some key differences in race riot violence that we've seen historically in the United States. And I say that because to me that there are two different kinds. First is a protest riot. You know, it's a reaction to principally racial and economic marginalization. It's exactly what we've seen in the George Floyd case. It's exactly what we saw with Rodney King. And it's exactly what we saw with Watson 65. And if you broaden that out, in the 1960s, you know, the Kerner Commission report in 1968 that looked at police community relationships, but also the outbreak of numerous riots throughout the country, that also sort of points out that these are all a response to structural conditions. Now, there are other forms of race riots that have been more, that were more common in a much earlier period. These were sort of government riots, collective acts of violence, mostly against integrating Black populations in certain parts of the North and the South. But then it also kind of includes conquest violence that you saw in the Southwest. You know, before the lands that you all are now occupying were considered the United States. So this is a sort of a historical moment that goes back to before police departments existed in that part of the country. And I think it's important to understand these distinctions and why the George Floyd protests is a protest riot, because this is going to continue to happen unless we take seriously the need for racial and economic justice. And it needs to be taken seriously at this large structural level. You see that there is a sort of cyclical pattern. You see that every 30 years, there is a moment that makes us refocus our attention on the problems in Black and Brown communities, particularly with city governments and police departments. And I think that unless, and in the past, part of the reason why structural change has not been pushed forward is because you see a lot of institutional pushback. You see police departments who are very strong, police unions who are very strong at lobbying and preventing reform efforts from being put forward. You also see city governments failing to fund and promote certain kinds of programs and efforts that become suggestions directly after riots. So many times after riots, you get riot commissions. You know, these organizations that are often put forward by governments that are meant to investigate the preconditions of a riot, all of the damage that was caused during the riot, and then the aftermath, right? They also make recommendations for what kinds of changes need to be made, whether it includes sort of state organizations or city governmental changes or just changes within the police. Typically, police are, and again, this is since the 1960s, this has been overwhelmingly the case, that police have been a key riot precondition. Not only is it often the last straw, but you also see sort of systemic abuse that leads up to the kinds of violence that we saw more recently. The LAPD is a prime example. You know, between the late 1980s and the early 90s, when the Rodney King riots erupted, there was a huge growth in reports of abuse in that time. But it was all happening in this time when crime rates throughout the country were going up. So the attention on police abuse was more. The attitude among a lot of people in Los Angeles at the time was that was a lesser evil than gang crime and violence, which people perceived as being sort of out of control at that particular moment. But nonetheless, after the Rodney King riots, what you saw is that there were suggestions for structural changes on 4 different planes and 4 different factors. You saw that there was a need for enhanced community engagement. You needed to. There was a commission that also suggested the need for enhanced training and educational measures within the department, especially as they're recruiting new officers and getting them on to the force. You also saw commissions suggesting the need for increased workforce diversity, having more Black officers, having more brown officers, having more officers that are identified as trans or queer. All of this in the hopes of making the department itself through a broader swath of the community, just having the facility to be able to communicate with a much more expansive body that is of the public than they would have previously. And the last that you often see is an increase or enhancement in external oversight measures. That historically that has meant strengthening the police commission, giving them more money to do more thorough investigations into police misconduct and abuse cases. But LAPD is a leader in historically and nationally in terms of being able to shield itself from external oversight. Yes, the police board has existed since the 1960s, and it's arguably in a much different state than when it was then. But the department also has a number of internal measures, like everybody knows about internal affairs and the conflict that you see between officers and the internal affairs detective. Los Angeles Police Department was one of the front runners in using that kind of division to oversee their officers and correct for mistakes that were being made or correct for problematic policies. But those also made sure that it was kind of an in-house problem. So those kinds of things undermined a lot of the larger actions that police boards are supposed to serve in terms of examining cases of misconduct and abuse and then suggesting disciplinary actions thereafter. Part of the reason why, again, these 4 areas have not been well implemented in police departments, particularly in places like Los Angeles, is because there is not a whole lot of structural support, right? You need to be able to fund these efforts over time. Police departments are, especially, like I said, the LAPD is very autonomous from the city government in a lot of ways. And a lot of departments are increasingly becoming, are getting into that same mode or that same relationship dynamic with city government. So often structural changes just haven't been supported, they haven't been implemented. If departments, officers on the inside don't support a particular program, then the implementation becomes undermined. And to the public and to the city governments who are examining the implementation of these programs, it just looks like it's ineffective. But there's a lot of questions about how, whether and to what degree programs are being implemented effectively on the inside as well. Last thing I'll say is about a number of new conversations that, I mean, they're not necessarily new. These are conversations that people in the policing realm have been hearing about for a long time, but now it's becoming a much more common to hear things like, people are calling for the need to defund, demilitarize, or dismantle the police. Now, what does that mean? Is that actually going to be a reality? What does that actually look like on the ground? So to dismantle the police, from my understanding, that's a much more aggressive framing than what I understand as an abolitionist perspective. Typically what that means is just reducing the public's reliance or need on the police, having other public institutions take on responsibilities that are currently given to police that police are just not equipped to handle. And in examples like medical or psychological emergencies that have often, in the past resulted in deaths or cases of abuse. And a lot of times it's because officers are being asked to do things that they're just not equipped to deal with. They don't have that kind of training. It's not as specialized. You need to have someone who has a familiarity and ability to communicate in those kinds of situations in order to make them effective. And that's just an example of what it would mean to sort of like dismantle, right? Just to give another institution a specific set of responsibilities that officers are currently being asked to do that it's probably not appropriate for them to do. That also brings in this notion of defunding. So that just means giving, rather than financially supporting departments and enabling them to buy more and a more expansive array of military equipment, and you start funding organizations like the ones I just mentioned, or people who are doing role or are participating in the government in that way, and also organizations like Child and Family Services and social work agencies. For specific kinds of crime, the ones that I'm most familiar with, drug crime, for instance, harm reduction, drug legalization, economic development programs, all of these things that address a much broader set of root causes of drug crime and is much better able to reintegrate members of the public back into the communities. These kinds of things have a potential to have a much more lasting effect than outright criminalization. Gang crime, similarly, having community and youth job centers, building the community's capacity to control crime, things that harken back to the Chicago area projects of the 1930s. Like, these are the kinds of programs that we are now calling abolitionist, which back then it was just what you did. It was like the liberal reform strategy. And the last is to demilitarize. What does it mean to demilitarize? Now, that really has to do with a broad range of things that I don't really have time to cover, but I'll say just in short that to demilitarize the police is going to be a long, arduous process, because you have to talk about changing not only training, but the ways, the kinds of people that become drawn into the field of policing, the federal programs that have both facilitated and financially supported the transfer of military weapons to departments, and the questions around officer safety that also justify that have historically justified the increased militarization of police over time. All of those things would have to change in order for a serious conversation about demilitarization to happen and to push those kinds of things forward. Whether we're there at the moment, I'm happy that we have Black Lives Matter posters up in downtown LA. Being a Southern California kid, I never imagined seeing things like that. The fact that you have celebrities and athletes going to protests now and sort of banging on these same kinds of drums is also, it kind of reminds me of the energy that we had in the 1960s. I can't remember the athlete's name, but the guy that put up the Black Panther fist at the Olympic Games, like those kinds of images are what we're seeing now with everything going on with Kaepernick. I'm happy those things are happening. Whether that is enough energy to really push us forward in terms of making the kind of reform changes that we need in policing, I don't know. But I'm glad that we're having the conversations, and the more that we can sustain this, the better chances will be. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gascon. I appreciate that. That was a true hefty amount of information. I'm in full agreement with a lot of things that you, well, pretty much almost everything that you are saying. Honestly, I've been, thinking about this. Well, I mean, in terms of all these different conversations, everything that's going on right now, it's pretty much the only topic to actually think about. And just to speak to, what you've been saying, like, the two men at the Olympics and stuff like that, like, and then Kaepernick and stuff. It's like, it's great all these things are happening. It's great we have celebrities and different people in like these positions of power speaking out, but it's sad that we're still in this area of, so like civil rights and stuff like this. Like, it's 2020 and people are still being hung from trees and stuff like that. And then they're being considered suicides. They're not even getting the justice for it. So it's like, we haven't excelled at all. Like the only thing that has changed is the number within the year, but we might as well still be living how we've been living, back in the past and stuff like that. In terms of the police and everything, there is no, I don't see us reforming it at all. I don't see us reforming because I mean they enforce the laws. The laws are the laws are like racism is it's instituted into our world. It is there. It is going to be. It has been there for I don't know how long, and we don't know how long it's going to continue. We are trying to stop it right now, but it's like this is our present day. This is what we have to realize, is what we have to witness. And it's like people, like the fact that people have I'm gonna just say people are dumb enough. I was trying to think of something else, but the fact that people are dumb enough to think that racism still doesn't exist, or there isn't a disadvantage for people of color and stuff like that, like people and like for sure in particular, I don't know, it's just disrespectful to like I personally feel disrespected, like being in my skin and seeing all these different things, because then it's like I see the ignorance from different people. Like we could talk about somebody getting hung, and then people will bring up like what that person did in their past life or something like that. Like, I don't care what that person did in their past life. Does he have a right to be hung? Because if that's the case, then it's like all those people, all those politicians, all those people that are out there in sex trafficking rings, all that stuff, like they should be stoned. Then if he got hung for doing like for stealing something or whatever it may have been. Like those people in the like doing all those wicked things, those inhumane things in positions of power because they have money and stuff, like those people should get a way more harsh punishment than them. I don't know. It's really disrespectful to just sit here and then, like, you know, we have these conversations to where we're the mediators of everything. We're always trying to figure out how to make it to where this world realizes just exactly, you know, how many people are suffering economically and because of everything that's been instituted, and like all the racist people and that have upheld the system that has been, you know, working against people of color for so long. I don't know. That was a really great point. I appreciate it. I hope you guys are you know, asking questions and stuff like that. I feel like there's a lot of questions to be asked in terms of what you just spoke, Dr. Gascon. But at this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Michael Sierra-Arevalo.
Thanks very much, Cameron, and thank you for Liliana and for Daniel for your introductions. And Daniel's last point on militarization, I think a word that's thrown around a lot, but that's undergirding some of this really intransigent, really ingrained problem that Daniel's getting at is this question of culture. What is the culture within policing? And that's what my specialty is. My dissertation work and my ongoing book project is focusing on what I call perilous policing. Some past scholars like Forrest Stewart at Stanford have advanced something called, he advances the concept of therapeutic policing. So thinking about how policing has shifted towards a neoliberal model of service provision. So trying to get police officers on Skid Row in Los Angeles to connect individuals experiencing homelessness to services, often under threat of being imprisoned if they choose not to get them. Others have advanced this idea of police as information brokers. That's what they do, is gather information and they give it to insurance companies, they give it to hospitals, they connect this data. And so they're just trading in information. But when I began writing around with police in 2014, they kept saying officer safety, and they used it to explain everything. It was why they stood a certain way. It's why they handcuff people. It's why they use their lights and sirens. It's why they didn't use their lights and sirens. It explained everything in their world. And that in and of itself wasn't the issue. The issue was that, statistically speaking, policing is safer today than it's ever been. Line of duty deaths have been sharply decreasing for half a century. In fact, officers are far more likely to take their own lives than to be killed in the line of duty. So this was the puzzle that I encountered when I was in the field. So, well, how can you explain everything in your world based on officer safety if by the numbers, policing is actually getting safer? And so that was my goal, and that's kind of what the current book project is about. So I want to give just kind of a brief, broad arc about what the book is trying to do. And so this is based off of fieldwork in 3 US cities. All of them are large urban police departments. So these are not your average police department. Some people think that the average departments are actually quite large. Usually departments are very small. They average less than 50 people. So we're not talking about the average department. We're talking about the departments that I think capture headlines. The departments that I looked at are not as large as the LAPD, but they're closer to the LAPD than they are to your average local police department or your local sheriff's office. So the beginning of the book is trying to explain how policing has always been rooted in the assumption of threat. Historically, there was always some quote unquote dangerous class which needed to be controlled, which needed to be surveilled. In the European model of policing, this was often the serf labor. These were, if we think back to our Foucault, when power was diffused, these were the farmers, the people that were gathering crops. And the police arose as a means to control this rapidly growing urban environment, which began with industrialization. At a certain point, it was Catholics. At a certain point in the United States, it was Irish immigrants. But of course, in the US context, particularly in the Southeast and in the antebellum South, the dangerous class was Black people, was slaves. And this was part of that history of the transition from slave patrols, particularly in the South and the Southeast United States, into what became our first sheriff's offices and our first local police departments. The story is a little bit different in the Northeast, but it's not actually separate. Those Northeastern departments may not have had slave patrols, but they were actively, for example, returning captured runaway slaves to Southern police departments. In my home state of Texas, the Texas Rangers were involved in the wholesale massacre of Native Mexicans, of Native Americans, of Mexican Americans. All of these various groups at various times were considered a dangerous class, and the police were able to justify their existence, including expanded funding, expanded training, more resources, based on the assumption of threat, the construction of some form of threat. And so in that first part of the book, what I do is trace the development of this threat through the course of policing. And that takes us from the instantiation of police all the way through the war. It takes us through McCarthyism. It takes us through the Red Scare. It takes us through the war on crime, the war on drugs, and the war on terror. And those were kind of a very seamless transition across those various wars, all of which were based on the assumption of threat, and which led to a broader and broader expansion of the policing apparatus in the US. And then the book goes very deep into the fieldwork. And so one of the chapters is all about, how do you learn this? How do you go about teaching 20-year-olds that they might be murdered at any moment and that they need to take steps to keep themselves and their fellow officers safe? And so a big part of that story is in the academy. The academy is where officers begin to learn this religion, this pseudo-religious concept of officer safety that cannot be questioned under any circumstances. Because if you do question it, you are an unsafe officer. And one way to get yourself fired is to be accused of being unsafe. And part of this process, and part of what is so nefarious about the process, is that nobody has to explicitly mention race. There is no section in the official departmental general orders or the curriculum that says that you should be especially scared of Black people or Latino people or people dressed a certain way. The language is of bad guys, it's of suspects. But we already know that we and policing as an institution exists in a system that is already laden with these very racialized understandings of who is criminal and who is violent and who is dangerous. And so race never need be spoken, but is constantly in the background. And officers are inundated with videos of officers being shot, officers being killed, of car stops gone bad, of walking stops gone bad. They learn how to shoot. They don't shoot to kill, they shoot to stop the threat. And they're learning this language for explaining how they deploy violence in an effort to stay safe. Of course, shooting to stop the threat is shooting to kill because you're shooting for someone's center mass. It's very likely to kill someone if you shoot them in the lungs or you shoot them in the heart. But there's all these linguistic ways of justifying what is fundamentally a deployment of force on the part of police officers. And then there's things like the memorial wall. There's things like tattoos. There's things like funeral pamphlets. These are things that are just around the police department, which reify the sense of danger for officers. And what the book tries to conclude with is that to understand why these problems are so consistent across time, which I think several people have mentioned, that these are not new problems. These are not, the warrior cop is just a new term for something that's existed for at least half a century. It's existed for as long as we've studied police. Is that these things are baked into policies, they're baked into laws. It's why police continue to be let off, even if they are charged, they're not found guilty of crimes because of decisions like Graham v. Connor, which prize officer perception above all else. If an officer can justify based on their perception that they felt threatened, that they saw a furtive movement, that they couldn't tell what was in their hand, but it appeared metallic, the law says that that officer was acting in a reasonable manner. By the law, that officer is not going to be found guilty. So these ways of understanding how police should do their work, and in fact, the assumption of dangerous police work results in this feedback loop between the assumptions of danger and the law then structures policing, which structures the training, which structures the policy. And so there is this feedback loop where the assumption changes the practice, which changes the law, which affects the practice. And so that is very broad strokes for a project that's been going on for about half a decade at this point. Still have to finish the book. But I'm happy to answer any questions. I wanted to try and keep it as short as I could. So happy to answer any questions about that field work or field any questions about the culture. And I generally tend to agree with Daniel. It's a very sticky problem because this is a story about what's at the heart of policing. This is not a new thing. Policing has been this way and will likely continue to be this way, barring seismic structural shifts in law, the economy, and in other sections of social life.
Thank you so much for sharing with us everything that you had an opportunity to work on and work around. I personally found your contribution very interesting, hearing firsthand, especially the type of language that's being taught as a way to excuse violence. And I thank you for straight up saying it very straightforward, that the language is used to excuse the violence, the unnecessary violence and biases that they do have against people of color. So thank you for your contributions. I want to transition over to Dr. Annika Anderson, our professor of sociology here at CSUSB. And she actually specializes and has done a lot of work and research. It even is published in criminology and looking into re-entry and re-education around the police force, around jails, around the prison system. And I've really enjoyed my conversations with you in the past. I just have to say that everything you say is always just so enlightening, on point. So please take the floor, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you for inviting me, and you know, it's always good to hear the perspective of students, and so that's why I was really thrilled to see that this was a student-led kind of conversation. Are you guys able to hear me? Okay, perfect. All right, so I just wanted to start off by again thanking you for inviting me to speak, and for my fellow Racial Democracy, Crime, and Justice Network colleagues for coming and talking from outside of the university, and Liliana, who has been a great friend and colleague since I got here. So as you mentioned before that, I'm in the Department of Sociology, and I teach classes on deviant behavior, criminology, race, and ethnic relations. And I'm starting to teach a new class on crime assistance and reentry in the spring. I'm also the director of Project Rebound, which is a campus-based reentry program that helps formerly incarcerated students enroll in and graduate with degrees from Cal State San Bernardino. So as someone who specializes in criminology and social stratification, a lot of the issues going on today is really relevant to my work. But I also fight these battles daily. So in my teaching, in my research and service, and in my own personal life. And so my academic focus thus far has been as a criminologist, and really kind of the work that I look at centers on people who have already had contact with the criminal justice system. So those who are currently and formerly incarcerated. However, with the current concerns around police brutality and race, I'm also beginning to kind of consider stratification issues in my work. So specifically looking at race and how that works, particularly in San Bernardino County. I think this is important given that the San Bernardino County Board of Supervisors has recently declared racism to be a public health crisis and passed a resolution that recognizes that racism creates disparate outcomes in many areas of life, including, as Michael had mentioned, or Dan and I mentioned before, and also Michael, we're talking about institutional discrimination. So including housing, education, employment and economy, public safety, criminal justice, and physical and behavioral health. So across all of these kind of realms. And I was also looking at something recently online, thinking about this issue of public health and the emotional kind of labor that we do as people of color. And so I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that. And so, and it's also interesting to think about the cumulative effects of discrimination over time. So according to Dr. Relles-Powell, who also has a master's in public health, there's substantial evidence to suggest and to affirm that racism is a public health problem. When experiencing racism, like harassment on the street or discrimination from an employer, the brain triggers its evolutionary embedded stress response, so this fight or flight kind of mode. The heart pounds, breath quickens, and senses heighten to prepare the body to run or face a threat. But when a threat pops up every day, they activate this physiological response. In turn, this creates chronic stress that over time takes a life-altering toll. So really kind of thinking about this idea of the toll that it takes on people of color. And thinking about, my research so far has really looked at San Bernardino County specifically. And so just kind of keep, continuing in that vein. So this idea of how it affects mental health is feeling of being disconnected, lonely, kind of second guessing yourself in things. Again, this idea of increased survival mode, decreased trust and worry, increased risk of depression, anxiety. So these are the kind of things that can really impact the impact of racism on mental health. So this idea of feelings of powerlessness, that you can do the right thing and still end up with a horrific outcome. So for the folks who, because I think as a lot of these issues have recently kind of happened, I've seen a lot of my colleagues and friends and a lot of other activists, people who are currently entrenched in racial justice projects. And I really admire and applaud all the work that they are doing, really respect them for their efforts and bravery. But I also think, given all of this kind of, the emotional toll that it can kind of take on us all doing this kind of work, I do think it's okay to pass the baton if you're tired and need a break, or if you just need to step out of the ring for a bit. And if you just really need to take some time to reflect on how you might want to meaningfully contribute to these kind of issues in a long-lasting, impactful way. I think the work will always be there. So going back to one of the students before who said that, this idea that racism is really pervasive, I think that, it's always going to exist. Hierarchies are always going to exist, unfortunately. And so because of that, that work will always be there, and we can kind of contribute to it in our own time. And I say it also because it's important to avoid burnout, that state of emotional or physical exhaustion, because of the idea of not just the volume of the work, but the perception that the energy invested will not yield results. You invest all this time and energy, and at the end of the day, nothing's gonna change, or it's not gonna move as quickly as you think it will. I also think that you don't need to feel, you shouldn't have to feel a need to educate everyone all the time. And so these are all of those things that I kind of say to people who I know silence is definitely kind of a bad thing in some ways, but I think if you're silent, then your silence hopefully means you're taking time to meaningfully reflect on what you're going to do next. And when you can contribute, and there are a lot of meaningful ways. And I think it's not just the work of one person. I guess it goes back to Liliana's earlier point, and some of what the other panelists have said about this idea of institutional level. So we have to change on the individual level, the interactional level, and the institutional level. And I draw a little bit from Matthew Desmond and Mustafa Emmer Bayer, and their book that's called Race in America, and also some of the other scholars I've recently kind of seen and activists, and talk about some of the steps I think that we can kind of take. And so there's that idea of change at the individual level. Individuals can change the settings that they inhabit with the deliberate aim of putting themselves in contexts more conducive to growth. And so in some ways that could be exposing yourself to people that are perceived as the other, long studied as the contact hypothesis. Engaging with an other can reduce generalizations and oversimplification that come from incomplete and inaccurate information, including stereotypes and misconceptions. I think we can also engage in deliberate, again, reflection and critical moments of perplexity, which in turn can lead to that self-critical thought, like really kind of taking into account, how do I know my racial assumptions are true? How might my upbringing and racial identity be influencing my thinking? There's change at an interaction level in the sense that if you do encounter dealing with people who you think have those racist beliefs, do take their prejudices seriously, but don't necessarily yell at them or call them ignorant or anything like that. In some ways we have to realize that they do matter as individuals, and that their beliefs are most often tied to their personal experience, and they just might need exposure to some other ideas and maybe some other facts they might not have been open to before. Also, I think it's important to ask people questions about their experiences, to kind of really dig into why they think the ways that they do. And as we're doing this kind of work and engaging in these kind of conversations, it's important that if we want to change someone else's mind about something, that it's best if we do our own homework, educate ourselves. And so I'm going to post after in a little bit some resources that we can use to educate ourselves and on how to be better allies and learn about the history of what is happening. And I think that's because this idea that a critically informed citizen is really important to kind of counter some of the racism. And then I also want to talk about change at the institutional level. And this is important because it takes more than just a single conversation or diversity training session to adequately address racism. Change is needed on an institutional level in a sense that one change in one institution leads to changes in other institutions. So the economy, it's tied to, today we're talking about the state, we're talking about course, policing, prisons, but we also have to think about institutions of cultural production like the media and artistic institutions, and how that might play a role in media and negative kinds of representations of people of color. And so also this anti-discrimination laws existed for a long time, even and as some of people have mentioned in this like right now, but also in previous kind of panels on this series. In terms of affirmative action, one of my colleagues before was engaging in this debate in my sociology department, Jim Fenelon, of just kind of bringing to light this idea of how affirmative action has kind of changed. And we are making some strides. Last week, the California Senate did pass a semi-constitutional amendment, ACA 5, and it's the Opportunity for All Act that places a measure before voters this November. And if approved, it would serve to repeal Prop 209, which and really permit the use of race, gender, and ethnic diversity as factors in college admissions, government hiring, and government contracting. Some people are protesting, and if you choose to protest, it's also important to kind of to make sure that you know your rights and how to safely be a part of that change. And so I'm also going to post some information about how you can protest in a way that kind of protects yourself. So we kind of talked about this idea of I think Michael and Danny was talking about this before. This idea of really what we're going to do with the police departments. And so I am interested in that. So there's pressure on the police departments and politicians to do something, whether it's reforming law enforcement tactics, or as Dana mentioned before, defunding or even abolishing police departments. I'm still kind of really thinking through all of the kind of implications of those actions. And so for now, I'm just interested in kind of talking to you more and continuing on with this discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. It was something especially that you said in your presentation where, some moments can be teachable moments. So instead of calling people ignorant and calling them out on, it's oftentimes we can fix that moment by, correcting it and giving more facts in those situations. Again, a lot of people who deem themselves not racist, but still they carry on, certain manners of. It's just their upbringing. It's just their experiences that led them, and they may not know. So it's never a time where we can forget where there's teachable moments out there. We can always choose to educate. If one doesn't listen, then we move on. It's not a time. It is not the time for us to lose our cool or or even be transfer that sort of energy on ourselves in this time where we are now. So I thought that was exceptional in your presentation. So as we gear up for Q&As, I want to give my co-hosts any words that they would like to speak on our panelists as well. If there's anything that stuck out to you today before we move on to Q&As. And everyone that's in attendance, don't forget we have the Q&A at the bottom. It doesn't have to exactly be on anything that our panelists spoke on today. It could be something that's going on in your community that you would like to ask questions upon. maybe our panelists may have any insight on that. And also, Cameron, are you there? Did you have anything you want to add to today's presentations?
Yeah, I'm here, bro. Yeah, I'm here. My fault. Shoot. I mean, what can we add? I mean, the conversation was good. We didn't get too many questions.
Don't forget, everyone, that Dr. Anderson just placed some information inside of our chat for you all. So know your rights, know your safety rights. Definitely click on those links. Also, Dr. Gallegos did the same as well. So if you want to sign the petition and watch the documentary on the things that she presented earlier, that is all in there as well. So definitely get that context while you're there. And we also have Yvette. Do you have any words before we get into Q&A today?
Just thank you to all of the panelists for speaking so openly with all of us and for sharing your insight. Thank you also each of you for sharing your personal research. I found that very interesting to hear your firsthand recounts of what you saw in communities and how they connect to this conversation. So we really appreciate you all for shedding light in your own way.
Thank you. So as we get into Q&As, we did get a few today that I want to ask, and any panelists, if you could feel free to answer. But one came in from Brenda Martinez. We dedicate 4+ years of our lives obtaining higher education to pursue a career. Maybe police officers should invest some time in education prior to beginning a career in law enforcement. Dr. Gascon mentioned the need to change how or who we hire into our police departments. Who should we hire and how do we recruit?
Yeah, I was sort of answering that, and this is an ongoing conversation I have with my sister. She works for DCFS there in San Bernardino. She's a social worker, and that's often what I've always. I mean, I'll say it this way: I'm the tree-hugging hippie of the family. So whenever I say that law enforcement needs to be more like social work, they all think I'm crazy. But she, in particular, thinks that while it may make officers a little bit more like softer around the edges, that social work has historically had spelled a lot of bad outcomes for groups of color, and it's very it's very easy to forget when we're trying to clamor for solutions. At the same time, I do think that is a step in the right direction. I think another suggestion that I mentioned was that, currently here in my role in Boston is that I serve on the state Board of Higher Education. One of the current things that we're working on is accreditation for police officers. How much of their time in boot camp and time spent on the force should count towards college credit, right? The state has suggested that they can count up to 9 credit hours in a college class. I don't know what that breaks down to because it changes, but that's a lot of money and that's a lot of time invested. And frankly, I'm not sure that the boot camp and experience on the force is going to teach an officer the same kind of experience that they would taking my class in sociology on policing. I think the kinds of conversations that we would have about critical race, about the experiences of people of color, about the history of police in the United States, kind of things that Michael was raising about the sort of changes historically, what the roots are, how in many parts of the country, the reality of the slave patrols is still something that people wrestle with, right? They still see, there's that famous line in KRS-One where he talks about, overseer officer, right? The sort of linkage between that history, and that's something that for many people, it's not very easy to forget. So all that is to say that I think expanding educational requirements is something that we as faculty members can do also, because people in my position working with the state board are the kinds of folks making the kinds of recommendations. Granted, I'm often the lone voice on matters like this, and I'm kind of the newest person, so I don't have a whole lot of influence, but I think that the longer that faculty sort of changing the conversation about what criminal justice requirements should be, what requirements should be for officers when they start, I think that's going to push us in the right direction. In addition to, above and beyond, what other conversations about reform that need to be happening in city government.
Thank you, thank you. Any other panelists would like to speak on that question? I can read it again. It was referred to who should we hire and how do we recruit when it comes to law enforcement. If anyone else had any.
One, sorry, Mary, go ahead.
There you go.
Oh, please, Michael, you first.
It was just a brief note. I think that there's a lot to be said for hiring people that have college degrees, but I think it's actually for a reason that has a lot less to do with education and a lot more to do with getting older. So one thing that we know about college educated officers that counterintuitively, these officers are actually more likely to engage in certain kinds of low-level arrest activity than officers without college degrees. Now, we don't know why exactly. One theory is that those officers with college degrees might be better versed in the letter of the law. And so they are more confident when they choose to arrest because they know that they have their probable cause in line, they have their reasonable suspicion in line, they feel confident in making those arrests. We don't know for sure. One of the upsides of older officers is that we actually found, it's mixed evidence, we don't have good national data, but older officers don't get into as many uses of force as younger officers. And it's not because older officers are from a different pool, it's because generally people get involved in violence less as they get older. This is one of the few things that we know to be like a sociological, criminological fact, is that from the ages of about 14 to 25, that is the upswing in marijuana smoking, violence, aggression, speeding. Car insurance companies figured that a long time ago, that you don't rent cars to 20-year-olds because they make bad choices. I made bad choices when I was 20. But we systematically hire officers as young as 20 years old and then give them guns and handcuffs and arrest powers and incredible discretion. I'm not bagging on 20-year-olds, but if you could shift the mean just a few years and hire older officers, that is a way, without changing state laws, without changing use of force law, that you're now going to have a different subset of officers. And if you can make it to the age of 25 and you don't have DWIs, you don't have arrests for fighting, you don't have domestic violence charges, you're going to be selecting out a lot of the same kinds of behaviors that when you give somebody a badge and a gun, result in the kinds of conflict, results in the kind of excessive force, results in all the kinds of abuses that we know go hand in hand with police culture, with all those other problematic things.
I think that's absolutely right on. That's the first time I've ever heard the age component, but that makes so much sense. Organizational literature tells us that it is not the employees who change the organization. It's the organization that changes the employees. So if you are flipping hamburgers for 8 hours a day, you dream about hamburgers, right? I mean, it affects your head. And I think the culture of policing in this country is very enticing and to a 20-year-old. And it is quite likely that that 20-year-old is going to be a lot more affected by that culture than the 40-year-old or the 35-year-old or even the 30-year-old. So it will take this multi-pronged attack, pardon the war language, but it'll take a multi-pronged attack to fix the problems that we have in the United States in policing. I would just urge everyone to look at Camden, New Jersey, and some of you may have heard of what Camden has done. It is not a perfect system, but they just started over. They started over. And when you begin to believe and to understand that policing can only go as far as our tax dollars will allow them to go. I mean, I think that's, call me a cynic, but that's one of the reasons that you see these police chiefs kneeling with the crowd and hugging the crowd and taking off their masks and that kind of thing. I think I'm sorry, but I think it's a PR stunt. I don't think that because they're going to go right back and they're going to fight for millions and millions and millions of dollars without question. And let's not even talk about the millions that we, the citizens, put out for bad behavior of police officers. Millions and millions and millions that could go into our schools, that could go into our healthcare system, that could go into many, many other social service arenas than in policing. And so I do believe, I thank the panelists so much, because you all have given us a lot of food for thought in terms of how we fix this broken system. And you all are not the first to suggest that policing's goals have never stopped from the slave patrols all the way to the present day. Policing is meant to serve or to protect property and not human lives. It is meant to protect property. And the slaves were the most valuable property in the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries, the most valuable property. So that's, I think we will definitely solve this problem, but it has to be a concerted effort and the continuation of the exchange of ideas like we're doing today. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Texera. I think you were leaning towards, if you work on a job for so long, it kind of starts to consume you. So it's almost, like our public officials who has a term, a term to serve, where the police officers need to be voted back in. What if it was up to the public to vote these officers back into their position, based on their behavior over the last two, of course there's, when we're on our job and we get a report that we have to give that says how we've been doing. What's that report?
Evaluation,
yes. Of course,
yes.
there's
Right.
evaluations within the force, but if you're serving the people, maybe we should have some say-so on who's out there on the streets protecting and serving.
Actually has a police commission that's recognized as one of the strongest around the country, and they have it's like written into city government and law that half of the board of commissioners has to be composed of elected people from the public, and the other half it can be public officials. And they have the power to remove the chief, just like you're saying. I mean, that's like official, particularly in cases of misconduct and abuse. It's not a very prominent model, but it's one of the few and one of the more powerful ones around the country. If you go just across the bay in San Francisco, very conservative, much more like the one we have in Los Angeles than anything they've got.
And you can see why police departments push back on that. They don't want anyone going into their private houses and investigating them. But that's like if my son committed a crime, I tell the officials that we'll take care of it in my family, right? We'll be the judge, jury, and prosecutor and imprisoner in my own family. That makes no sense. So police departments all over the United States are in judgment of themselves, and that's why we have very few prosecutions. Also, the fact that the DAs are not real enthusiastic about doing that.
I bet you. I mean, they can come into our communities, but we definitely can't go into theirs. All right, Yvette, you want to take us away to the next Q&A?
Sure. There's a question in here from one of our participants, and he says, or they say that prioritizing budgets of 50% or more of our tax dollars for war and policing is wrong. How do we change that? Is it broken, or is it about keeping those in power safe? What do you all, the panelists, think of this question?
I can give it a crack. So I think that the conversation around defunding is honing in on this very phenomenon. The LAPD budget, I believe, is over $1 billion currently. In other news, the NYPD just had its budget slashed by $1 billion. So that's I think they had a $5 billion plus budget as of last year. But policing is usually the largest line item for any large city out of their general fund. In the chat, I just posted a new resource. Vera just posted 72 cities worth of budgetary information for 2020. It's actually broken down to a good level of detail. So you can see there things that are the same in any department. So its salaries are the number one thing. Officers, there's this article of faith within policing that police are paid very badly. The average officer in the US is paid very poorly, somewhere between 30 and 45,000 for like really hard, long hours, dealing with a lot of problems they're not equipped to solve. And it's a hard job. I know personally of officers in some large departments that make over $500,000 a year between their salary and their overtime, which is an absurd amount of money for any public employee to make. And so that's the overtime. You can see overtime in those budgets, for example. But one of the questions, and I think it was actually Gustavo who wrote it, was asking about why do we invest in this? Why do we continually throw money at policing? This is, like a lot about policing, part of a long tradition. This is not a new phenomenon. If anything, it's just gotten worse over time. If you're interested in this phenomenon, I highly recommend Elizabeth Hinton's book. She's a historian at Harvard University. Her book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, traces the development of American policy around social services during I believe it was the Johnson administration. He wanted to create sort of a new golden era and was going to create all of this infrastructure for a social safety net. But over time, policing sort of weaseled its way in. And so the only way that you could get community resources was if you had police distribute them. This was actually the birth of community policing before it was even called that. It was the localized substation, which you can still see in New Haven where I was for graduate school. There are these substations spread across the city. There's one in each of the 10 districts. That is a holdover from the development of community policing, literally putting smaller departments into communities in an effort to try and build relationships. That was the logic behind community policing. This exacerbated throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, from the war on drugs to the war on crime to the war on terror. And in large part, that's because it's a politically easy thing to do. the US has a decidedly punitive culture. Historically, policies around punishment have been voted on by both sides of the political aisle. In James Foreman's book, Locking Up Our Own, he traces the political conversations throughout the war on drugs, and he makes it very clear that if you think that the policies that led to mass incarceration were solely the work of old, straight, white politicians, you're wrong. There were prominent Black intellectuals, prominent Black leaders calling for increased policing, calling for more punishment. Now, they were calling for a lot of other things too, but they only got the policing. And that's been the historical arc in the US, is that Black communities in particular have called for education and jobs. And yes, they have sometimes called for more policing, and they only ever get more policing. That's something that both sides of the political aisle seem to be okay with signing off on, because after all, who wants to be seen as light or easy on crime? So that's, I think, part of why we're seeing it. How do we change that? I think the good news is it's beginning to change. I think that people like my colleague, Phil McHarris, he's a graduate student at Yale, who's very, very heavily involved with the Black Youth Project, very heavily involved with the Movement for Black Lives, he was just on Axios, he has a New York Times op-ed, have argued very convincingly that there are community services in place that can deal with things like violence. Pat Sharkey's book, Uneasy Peace, talks about how, yes, policing did reduce violence at extreme cost to communities of color. And there are other ways to do it, in that you can reduce violence by increasing community services. And I think now it's about finding political will and taking advantage of this moment to actually shift those things to those services. What we can't afford to do, and what I fear deeply, is that we're going to do things like defund the police, as in cut budgets, and we're not going to make good on the second part of that, which is give that money to communities. And all that's going to do is leave communities worse off than where they started. Because right now, policing, as dangerous as it can be and as damaging as it can be, is for many of these communities that are so cut off from institutions and so cut off from the resources that they need. Policing is one of the only institutions that actually responds to them. If you take that away, you are further isolating these communities if you don't give those funds to the services that they actually need, in which they've been trying to grow in their own homes.
Yeah, if I can add a little more on the sort of the roots of the current militarization issue and where I think it needs to go in the future. I mean, we shouldn't forget that it was coming out at the same time that we had conversations about the need for the war on poverty, right? The war on poverty is a set of federal programs that emerged after the 1968 riots that were happening, or well, in the late 60s that were happening all over the country. War on poverty is a set of programs that are trying to do things like dismantle and defund and start to rearrange governmental structures at the local level, but they were not supported for very long by the federal government. They went away, and instead conversations like Michael was saying started to gravitate towards more the need for crime control, the need for officer safety, and the need to maintain public order, right? All of this, obviously now looking back, is all of a set of code words for the control of people of color, but those conversations and this current moment in militarization all came from these conversations, same conversations that we're having again. And what needs to change now is that rather than think about officer safety, which, you know, there's a lot of recent studies that have been done comparing police officers' death to other fields, and I think it's something like loggers, like what are those shows about the logging? You know what I'm talking about, like the big tanker trucks.
Lumberjacks.
There you go. Thank you. Lumberjacks have die much more often than officers do, and there's a number of other fields that are like that, right? So, I mean, granted, like Michael was saying, the field of policing is not easy. You have to put yourself and your safety on the line every day, and their own primary concern is to go home to their families. I understand that piece of it, but when that is the only conversation we have about the needs for change in urban policing, I think that's a problem.
Thank you. Thank you both. I honestly feel the same way in terms of that. A huge problem we talked about it a little bit in our last conversation is that these different police that are, like you just said, like it's a tough job. It's a dangerous job to have, but it's like, in terms of, you're not policing, they haven't been policing in terms of criminal level. They've only been policing in terms of, you know, where these people fit, you know, economically and stuff like that, who these people are in terms of their skin color, who they are in terms of their ethnicity. That's the only thing that people are getting, you know, policed on. And also to what Dr. Sierra-Arevalo was saying, it's like the money not being implemented into the right areas and stuff, even after we do defund them and everything. Like, are they going to create the right programs that need to be implemented into those neighborhoods? Are they going to get the right counselors, the right social workers that need to be in those neighborhoods? Somebody else also had a question that pretty much ties into what I wanted to talk about for a little bit. Mr. Garcia, you said, how exactly would social workers and mental health workers be utilized if police reforms occur? Would they ride with police officers, or would they call in certain circumstances? I honestly don't believe that there could be a reform. Like, we have to abolish basically what has been going on for so long, because it's so much racism that's instituted into what's going on. If you stop your colleague or your partner from using excessive police force, you might be in more trouble than just allowing this to happen. Or you won't get in any trouble if you allow it to happen. That's nothing you could reform, especially if those people are just like, when George Floyd died, there was 3 police officers on his body, 1 on his neck, and then 1 standing in front of cops. Like, none of those other cops did anything. Like, that's nothing you could reform. They didn't see that what he was doing was inhumane at all. They just allowed it to happen. In fact, they stood self-righteous in the matter that it was happening. So it's like, you can't reform that.
Because they were allowed to do that.
Yeah. So it's like, if you stand self-righteous, but if you stand self-righteous and doing something inhumane, and it's like, I could see you as a criminal after doing something like that, but then it's like, you would still look at me as a criminal just because I'm black. Like, then there's no more conversation around that. There's something that needs to change within you, because it's like, you're looking just to, see a change that's within me that it isn't going to occur. I'm not going to wake up, the complexion that will make them feel more comfortable. So it's like, and then in terms of people like reforming it and then having social workers and them, like, I honestly believe that if we had enough minority officers that actually wanted to, make change within their neighborhoods and make change within what happens to their people, and the racist system wasn't still being upheld, then it's like, we would actually need something to where it's like, every officer, like, first, the training has to be like reformed for sure. Like, people need to know how to police who they're actually, getting this job to police, because it's like, you can't put a white officer in a black neighborhood and expect them to feel comfortable. That's not going to happen. You can't expect it to be, vice versa and stuff, in terms of black people in those neighborhoods and feel comfortable when it's a white officer. It's not the same. Like, we don't respond to each other. We've never responded to each other in a positive light. It's never been that way. Like, it's always been like, they're either an ally, or it's like, it's somebody who I'm going to have problems with. And but I do believe that there needs to be like a minority officer for each white officer. There needs to be different programs, and I don't know, everything that we're talking about needs to be instituted, and all those programs that we're talking about creating. I think all of them needs to actually happen, because there really isn't going to be any change, because the system is just being upheld.
I think I wanted to kind of chime in a little bit, because I think it's really difficult, I think, for both sides to have these conversations. I know last year, this is one of those things that I was like, okay, this is an epic failure on my part. Because last year I remember I tried to bring together people from the community, police officers who were really trying to engage in community policing efforts. They really wanted to give back and, kind of do this. We're trying to put on this symposium thing here at the university, and I was the chair of that committee, really trying to have officers talk about their perspectives, and bringing community members and activists to kind of talk about their perspectives. And it was really heated, angry arguments in which some people in the audience were formerly incarcerated. And there's, of course, this climate of distrust if you think that the police are really focusing on the criminal justice system in general is more punitive than really focus on a rehabilitation part of things. And so that it ended up, the whole committee that I tried to form, that whole group that I tried to form, just really was dysfunctional and ended up just breaking down. Because I think that, and that was the only time I've ever had it where I was like, wow, I really tried doing these things. And there were definitely some attacks in the sense that, I wanted to try to think about different kind of efforts. And some people said, no, we really need to overthrow the police force. We need to do all these kind of, really kind of thinking about things. And I guess more of a kind of, what's the word I want to say? More a little bit of a radical way of doing things. And I think that there are people who wanted to make smaller kind of steps and just like open up the conversation. And so I wanted to start with, okay, let's have a conversation and talk about what we're going to change before we move forward and pursue changes. And then I had some folks said, no, we need to go to Sacramento and lobby and do this right away. And the fact that you're not pushing to do this means that you're not really doing the work. That's what I was kind of told, and that I'm not pushing, and we're not all on the same page. And so it was really kind of difficult to kind of get the community to have these kind of conversations with the police. And so I just kind of wonder how you kind of really bridge that kind of a divide.
I've had a conversation with a former cop at a protest, and you know, while we were having the conversation, I could already tell he was ignorant to a lot of the things I was saying. You know, he was an older white cop, and at the end of the day, I still have respect for the job that they do. I do not have respect for cops that are racist, for cops that only police somebody off of their race and stuff like that. Those are the people I don't have respect for, because it's like you join the force and now you're acting like you're scared and you're in fear for your life, when it's like you're the person with the gun. This is a person who has a gun pointed at them, and they're not the ones that can say that they're in fear for the life. You're the one that can. So it's like for me, those are people I have zero respect for. Like when I talked to that former cop, one thing he brought it to me, which is honestly just retarded, because it's just like, for you to say that to me, it's like you're just too ignorant for me to even have this conversation with you. He said like, oh yeah, what about like black on black violence and stuff like that? It exists. I'm not going to say it does not exist, but if you don't see that black on black violence is systemic, that everything that goes on within these impoverished neighborhoods is systemic, they don't have no money. Like if we're going by themes, like themes, how we do papers and stuff like that, themes for black people and their lives is oppression, is discrimination, sorrow. You don't get the correct history about your people until you're well above the age of 18. You don't get any of that unless it's already been talked about in your households. You learn the U.S. curriculum up until you realize the U.S. curriculum has had you fooled the whole time. Like, to this day, I'm mad that I was standing for the Pledge of Allegiance, because that flag doesn't represent, I'm not free. There's no liberty. There's none of that for me. There's none of that for my people. So it's like, when that cop said that black on black violence stuff, it's just like, it's all systemic. Those people that are in those impoverished neighborhoods, they don't have no money. They like if the median for a black household is like 14,000, and then the median for a white household is 170,000, how is that not a disadvantage? How is that not going to make them succumb to a life of, I have to get it, I have to survive, I have to make sure that my kids eat, I have to make sure that I have a roof over my head, make sure, you know, my family is eating and stuff like that. But then those people are being looked at as the same people as criminals, when it's like, wait, you've been robbing them of a comfortable living their whole life. But it's like, that person goes and steals something for now that person's a criminal, but it's like, you robbed them their whole life. You robbed, like, black people have been robbed of a comfortable living, of all the people in these impoverished neighborhoods, and have to, you know, succumb to what oppression is and all that other stuff, racial discrimination, police brutality, everything. Like this is the theme of life that we have to live, and it's like that itself is criminal for those people to actually, you know, uphold that for so long, and then make it to where the light is shed on us as if we are the problem. And you know, for the longest we have been saying, and I'll continue saying, we are not the problem. The problem is that they've been the criminals this whole time, and we're the only ones viewed as a criminal, because they are also the law enforcers and the lawmakers. So it's like, you know, it seems like a dead battle, you know, especially how sick it is in this world. And but nah, you know, there ain't no, like, for 400 years we've been fighting, so there ain't no other choice but to continue to fight. But it really is disrespectful to live this way, and to also, you know, have the light shed on you as if you are the problem too, when it's like, you guys are the thieves, you guys are the colonizers, the gentrifiers, the everything in the book, man. And it's like, but we only get the you know, the bad light shed on us. And then, you know, for people that do excel and do something, hey, you will fit within the system until the system does not want you to fit within it no more.
Man, it's 2020, and every single day, every single month, there's the first black person to become a CEO. I mean, come on, how is this possible?
Bro,
I would like to add something real quick, if that's okay.
Yes, definitely.
And I want to speak to what Dr. Sierra-Arevalo said about, you know, and what you guys been talking about as well right now, in terms of, it was black people who, you know, called for the police, et cetera, you know, all that stuff. So as you know, we live under a current taken form of believing or even imagining life that could be. You know what I mean? Like we live under something that's been taken, and we've been fed a certain logic, which is not from me. I'm not saying this. This is Frantz Fanon, Martinican philosopher, who spoke about the dichotomous and limited perspective that is brought upon by colonial logic, or he called it the perverse logic, or the fucked up way in which we're meant to think about ourselves, each other, and the world in general. And it's basically cemented on binary thinking, or you're thinking of black or white, good, bad, which in its own comes from like old, Manichaeism, old way of thinking that comes from Europe. And so we have this, we have been trying to survive within this kind of like choice between, well, what do you want, snakes, or do you want, wasps? Like it's like you want to choose between a snake and a scorpion. Choose. And if you tell people choose, you have to choose. Most people will choose because they feel like they have to choose one or the other. It's like, no, I don't want any of that. I want bunnies, like it's just like that rarely comes from people, right? It's kind of like you have to think outside of that setup to even think beyond what is possible, right? That's why we keep talking about reform, right? And Kameron and I agree with you completely, like, no, we can't reform what's there. We have to actually rebuild. And the way that this starts, this binary thinking, it begins with the destruction, obliteration of our history, our understanding, our culture, our knowledge, our epistemology. So it began with the destruction and with seeing what we held as beliefs of cosmovisions or ideas or ways that we saw the world as a people were completely disregarded and burnt, literally destroyed. But they weren't completely destroyed. We still held on to our beliefs and understandings in ways in which they couldn't see that we were doing that, right? So we hide behind certain images or certain ways that we act, but in reality, we are resisting, right? So this is resistance methods, and this is, Ramon Grosfoguel calls it subversive complicity, right? So for example, they found during the Mexican Revolution, they found in their churches, because the churches were destroyed by the people won the Mexican Revolution, actually. And so they went and destroyed, and under the crosses and under the virgins and all that, they found representations that were of the indigenous Mexica that lived there before. And so they would place representations under, because this was something that was done before colonial times. The representations were built above, like an onion, right? The pyramids have several like onions. So there's a little pyramid, a smaller pyramid, like that, right? So they wanted to continue that. And that was a metaphorical way or a symbolic way of resisting. And just because the people who were writing the books and teaching didn't understand what was going on, that doesn't mean it wasn't going on, right? So that's why we have this way of thinking that becomes very limited to the point where, for example, the Mexican Revolution was won, and then Francisco Madero comes in, who's actually really good friends with the revolutionaries who were indigenous and from the north, who were agriculturers. And at the end of the day, we have a Mexican who is a student of Ivy League schools in the United States, coming in and imitating the formation of the nation forms from Europe and the United States. So like, you're gonna come in and implement a new way of teaching. No, it's not so much in the content as it is in the format, in the way in which we do things, right? So if we look, for example, at people who were, they were Black and they were calling for more police, but what were the options? What were the options then, right? How much education was there though? I mean, I'm talking about stuff that was written in the 60s, right? Like by Fanon and Freire, like it was written in the 60s and it was banned from universities. Like if you wanted to read this stuff, I would go print out and like, put it in your pocket so that you could read the chapter. That's how people were doing it in Latin America and much less in the United States, right? So I think we need to start thinking about outside of those limitations, right? Black on black crime, so what? Like white on white crime, brown on brown crime, that's usually the case. You're gonna attack those who are near you, right? Usually people who get killed are killed by someone they know, right? But again, it only works because we're functioning under that way of thinking, that coloniality, perverse logic.
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. Because also like just what you're talking about, it's like there's something called like the Willie Lynch letter, and it's pretty much the whole dismantling of of my race and how we respond to each other too. Because it's like there's like so many things that, within like the one thing that has really dismantled the way our people respond to each other in a positive light has been putting the dark-skinned person up against the light-skinned person. Because it's like, now it's like even within ourselves, there's no, like, that person doesn't feel as black as me, and now I don't feel like that person is as black as me. Like, that is all false. Like, that doesn't even make sense. Me and that person could go outside and we both can get killed by a police officer. And that's the way I viewed it. And I mean, I'm not saying that, a police officer, well, actually.
And Kameron, that is still white supremacy, because we have that too in Mexican culture, like with brown people, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, oh, hopefully the baby comes out with blue eyes. They never say, hopefully the baby comes out with the bronzest, the most beautiful brownest eyes you've ever seen, like, because it's not reverse racism. It's not, that doesn't exist. It's still white supremacy. You know what I mean? That we've been,
and Kameron is much more likely to, a darker skinned person is much more likely to get shot. Darker skinned people are much more likely to be convicted by a jury. Dark skinned people are much more likely to get beaten by cops, to be followed in the stores. So white supremacy reigns. Can I just address something that Annika said when she tried to put police officers on your board, and I think you in a self-reflective way, you said it was a mistake, right? And I totally agree. Because those police officers that are sent to on committees and community committees, they are PR people. Sure, they have worked out in the street, but they are PR people, and they're always going to talk the company line, right? They're not going to say, yeah, you need to take our guns away from us, you need to take more money away from us. They're not going to do it. They're intransigent, and their unions have forbade them to go out in the community and talk, police reform. They're just not going to do it. In fact, because I was in policing for a few years in Los Angeles, and I worked in community relations, which they called communist relations. Thank you very much. And I, my part of my job, and I'm not happy in another self-reflective mood. I am not happy about the things that I had to do, but one of the things was to mollify the public. That was the main goal of my PR in the LA Sheriff's Department, was to mollify the public. Yes, I know he beat up your son, but give him a chance. It's his first time doing it. Whatever it took. On Monday mornings when I came into the office, I had a whole list of police complaints. And I fed them the company line. These folks are good people. They're just under a lot of pressure, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess my suggestion to you, Annika, is don't have any more cops on your panels, because that's what they're going to do. I mean, they can't do anything else but to do that. And the other thing, just very, very quickly, when Kameron said we need more officers of color, There's a study that just came out recently, and I wish I could cite it the way you all cite your work so well. But it said that a Black police officer and a Latino police officer is just as likely to beat up people as a white officer, because it is the system that makes them do that. It is the system that makes them do that. So you can, unless you change the rules of the game, unless you tear it down and rebuild it, you're going to have the same effect. You're going to have the same effects. So, so just let's not replace one bad officer with another bad officer just because he's got a deeper tan. You know, we need to change the entire system. I don't care if it's all white people who patrol the streets of Los Angeles or San Bernardino, as long as they are doing a good job. But if they're not, kick them out. Kick them out.
I just wanted to say thank you very much for letting me ask a question, but this is for our panelists. I've heard really great dialogue and discourse, but I haven't really heard a big vision. Like for the panelists that are very versed in the history, it seems like if we care for history so much, we're basically destroying ourselves now. So we need radical change, radical ideas. And radical means that there's true equity in our culture, the promise that has never happened. So from our panelists, can you please offer one idea that someone who's powerful, who has the money and the resources, can offer change to our people? And our people means all of us who care. Thank you.
Anybody want to take that?
Sure. I mean, I can jump in.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, Mary.
I was just going to say, it's not going to take just one, Gustavo. It's going to take a whole lot of folks. What was the motto of the United Farm Workers? The people united will never be defeated. So it's going to take a huge, vast, millions and millions and millions of people to make change happen. I am very, very excited because I have never, ever, ever heard the term defund the policing. Now that may, you know, we've used it so much in the last month or so, but I've never heard that term before. And then you go, what? Of course, the unions will not allow people to prosecute the police. It will not allow them to be fired. So take the money away. Take what feeds them. What feeds them. Go ahead, Daniel.
On Mary's point for Gustavo's question, yeah, it's not going to be one single vision. I mean, part of the problem is that we already have one institution who's dealing with 1,000 different problems, and they're not well equipped to do, you know, most of them. What we need is what people are currently doing and in their own small isolated corners of the country, and trying to reclaim some of those responsibilities for themselves, right? I mentioned in my talk about, you know, dealing with gang crime or drug crime, you know, offering alternative solutions to problems that people have practically every day. If you talk to, in my own conversations, because I worked with young people in San Bernardino before I entered academia, in my experience there, and most of them were coming out of the juvenile prisons and were gang involved. The majority of them said that they would never have joined a gang had they had a job, even at McDonald's, even if they had been able to get a serious phone call or a serious job offer, something that didn't entail a great deal of violence on a day-to-day basis, would have been much more preferable. But those kinds of basic needs are not being met in a lot of these communities, and it contributes to create those kinds of problems. And it also, from a government representative's perspective, you know, 10,000 feet above, the only thing that they need or feel like they need, that the community needs, is to be cleaned up. So police and law enforcement and criminal justice becomes the expedient solution to a problem that's much broader, that's going to be much more expensive, and that's in the short term, and that's going to take a lot more commitment to put forward to build towards the future. So that means things like, again, promoting racial and economic justice, having the community take over responsibilities that police can't do. In Oakland, people are training one another to become community health workers, to respond when there's a, let's say the few of us who are here, are at a party and I get shot. None of us are presumably trained in that moment on how to deal with it. So we rely on police. The history of Oakland is that people have gotten shot and killed because officers show up to a scene thinking that they have the perpetrator in front of them when it's actually the victim. And it's those kinds of situations that we want to limit or minimize the contact that police have or that the public have with the police, so that the public can take much more responsibility in dealing with the kinds of issues, in dealing with those kinds of problems that they're much more familiar with. I mean, there's cases also of young people with, I think there was a case in Dallas, a young man was known in the community to have a mental illness. When he showed up to his mother's house because she called about being unable to control him, right? He showed up to the door holding a screwdriver, and he had just been repairing a vacuum, and the officer mistook the whole encounter and shot the young man in the doorstep where his mother was standing. And it's because in that moment, officers are not prepared to deal with those kinds of situations, and we need to maximize, we need to put people in situations who are equipped to deal with those kinds of situations. And I think that's true for mental health. I think that's true for drug problems. I think that's true for a lot of situations that people are in. A lot of situations that people are in the communities that we've been talking about so far. Sorry, that was a really long.
I'm just going to say, but undergirding all of that is racism, is white supremacy. Because if you are a white supremacist, if you believe in racism, if you are a racist, a screwdriver looks like a gun. In the case of not Abner Louima, but Amadou Diallo, a comb looks like a gun. A wallet looks like a gun. So that has to be rooted out at its core, its core.
No, I agree completely. Like that, it doesn't even make sense. They showed up to City Hall with guns, and nothing happened. There wasn't no rubber bullets. There wasn't anything that happened. So it's like we all know it's a race thing. We all know it's a black person with something in their hand, opposed to a white person with a gun in their hand that could go to stand in front of City Hall, yell and scream in front of a cop's face because they want to wear a mask, or because they don't want to wear a mask and they want to go to the gym and stuff like that. We already know what problems we're dealing with here. And then I just wanted to pretty much also chime into what Gustavo was saying. Like we do most definitely need radical change. Like if I was to say in terms of things that would be radical, it's like we know people in Congress, we know people in the House, we know people in the Senate. We know that those people have always upheld this racist system. These are the people that should be getting charged of doing these criminal acts against these people that are, because they're not allowing people their liberty. They're not allowing these people to stop being oppressed because they keep on allowing this system to happen. So it's like the fact that the majority of the world is in the streets right now, the majority of the world is in oppressed and is fighting this right now, then it's like, why can't it be as quick as we say, okay, we the people that are also within this Constitution, we the people that are out here fighting for our lives, we the people that are oppressed like this, we are sick and tired of talking to brick walls. So for what we will have all the people that are standing above the law and stuff like that, like Congress, the House, the Senate, President and stuff, everything like that, we would like them to come down. We would like to have a conversation in terms of who do we need to get rid of, because if there are people with multiple offenses of racial discrimination and all this other stuff, those people, hey, I'm sorry to break it to you, but I'm really not. You got to go. You fired. And I honestly don't care what happens to your life after this point. But it's like, we need to abolish and eradicate the leadership that they have upheld for so long, and and appoint the people that we want to appoint, and start implementing the actual things that we want to implement within legislation, within our different communities and everything, because we can't keep on saying we want something like this or we want this, because then they'll change the whole wording around and make it to where it's like now it involves economics, or now it involves like how is it going to benefit this person more or benefit this person more. When we ask for different things, we say it plain and simple, but then it's like it always turns into something else. We said Black Lives Matter. They said, wait, are you saying only Black Lives Matter? Like, nobody ever said only. Nobody ever so the fact that we can't even have this conversation without our words being turned around means it's time for us to just, stop conversating. It's time, like, the way this is one thing I view, like, when Obama walked into the White House, he walked in, he shook everybody's hand and, hugged everybody, left out, and they spit on the floor when that man left. But it's like he walked in, so, he walked in with respect and stuff like that. At this point, when it's like, when we've been getting killed for so long and doing all this, we can't walk in the house no more with respect. Like, it seemed like we just got to walk in belligerently and, hey, go kick your feet on their table and let them know you ain't leaving until you have heard, or until you've been heard, and until you've gotten what you need to get out of them. And, because we need to get people out of the positions that they have, because they've been in those positions of power for far too long, and they've been upholding this racist system for far too long. I love the conversation. I know everybody wants to continue. I know we're getting in different conversations and stuff like this, but at this time, I'd like to pass it to Marlo so you can close out.
So again, everyone, thank you for continuing to come back every week to hear the voices of these amazing panelists, to hear the different aspects, the different insight, the different professional intake that you get every day from people that's out here, that's serving in these quarters, and that sees the light at the end of this tunnel. I want to remind you that each Wednesday night at 4 p.m., we will be continuing conversations on race and policing. Next week, we have a very special topic and very special guest that'll be on the show, where we continue the conversation on activism and what can be done next. So again, I want to sign out tonight. I really want to thank all of my panelists. Special conversations today. We can't do this without you guys. I know we're the students, and I know a great, important, and inspiring time of your jobs and your day-to-day is to be able to talk to the youth. And we're here, and we're ready to talk back as well. We have insight. If the future matters, we're here to serve together. So together we will define this future. And we are signing off. See you all next week.